This week's neighbor is in the book of Job. They've had to wait for us a couple of weeks, and we've been able to spend time in prayer. If you haven't watched the last two videos, I encourage you to go back and look at those, spend time with those. It's just time with you and God. Time reading, time listening, and time praying. So again, if you haven't done that, I invite you to go back and look. And if you have, and it's something that you benefited from, they're still there, go back and you can go through those again. But tonight, providentially, it may have worked out better that this neighbor waited for us. Their situation may match ours better than ever before. To help orient us, if you will, if you've got your Bible, open to the first two chapters of Job. If you haven't read them recently, go ahead and pause me and spend time looking at those. Either read that word for word or just kind of look through and refresh your memory on what's going on in Job's life, what's happening to him. And once you find yourself in chapter 1, this first question, what do we learn about Job in chapter 1? What do we learn about Job in chapter 1? As you look through those words, what is it that he has? And with that same thought, what is it that he loses? Well, his oxen, his donkeys, and servants are gone. You read a little bit further and you find out sheep and servants are gone. Then camels and servants are gone. Finally, his sons and his daughters are killed. This is just in the first few words of this book. What are some things that we read or experience in our life about what's happening to what we own? As you think about Job's oxen and donkeys and sheep, which we don't own, but those were his possessions. What are some things that happen to our possessions, the things that we own? I can think just the other day having 3 flat tires on 2 vehicles. It in no way compares to Job, but it just reminds me the things we have, they don't always do what they're supposed to do, and sometimes bad things happen to the things around us. What about you? What are some of the things that have happened to what you own or to the people you know? Sometimes it's fire. Sometimes it's the house fire. Sometimes it's theft. It can be at home or in the workplace or from the car. And maybe the flood. Sometimes that's what can happen to people's belongings. The tornado. Those things that claim what we own. And some of those can be very similar to what was described to happening to Job. What also happens to the people around us? What happens to the people around us? We read about Job and losing his sons and his daughters. What happened to the people around us that takes them? Well, it can be sickness, and it can very well be death. And that death can be the result of tragedy, these unexpected occurrences. Sometimes our belongings and those we know, sometimes they can be claimed in the same event. Horrific circumstances. In Job chapter 2, Job's own health, his own life is next. As you think about your past, what health problems have you had? That's one you certainly don't have to think too long on. You know, that's recorded very deeply. It may be the disease, the cancer. It might be the transplant. It could be the chronic conditions, the ones that everybody seems to know about or just only you know about, but it's a battle every single day with an activity, with something that you take part in or can no longer take part in. It might be the brokenness or the sprain of that just seem to happen every couple of years or come in pairs. When your body's affected, it can seem to affect everything around you. And that's what we can use to help us envision how Job must have felt, at least in part. And why is all this going on in Job's life? What do we figure out just from these first 2 chapters? Well, God's allowing him to be tested. That's all we know. That's all we're made privy to. It's the age-old question of why do bad things happen to good people? The curtains opened up a little bit and we're able to see behind, but that question is not fully answered, and that's the premise of the book of Job. We wrestle with the question while Job, he scrapes himself with a broken piece of pottery. His skin is that bad and he's just scraping himself. We won't look at that question right now, why bad things happen to good people, because we want to look at one of our neighbors. It's someone who lived in a different time, in a different place than us, but shared a time and a place with Job. So in comes Mrs. Job, chapter 2, verse 9. His wife said to him, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." He replied, "You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. To you, what's the most shocking part about her statement? Let me read that again. She says, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." What is most shocking about her statement? It may be that it's very bold. I mean, she doesn't say a lot, but what she says, it hits you with a force. Sounds like it hit Job with a force. What appears to be her theory? What appears to be her theory? And again, as so often happens, we read between the lines to try to figure out, what does it appear that she's thinking as she says this? Could very well be that, like Job's friends that we'll read about later on, that she subscribes to the thinking that bad things are happening to you because you've done bad things. That could very well be her theory. Hebrew scholars explain that the word that we translate as curse here can also be translated as bless. So it could read, she might be saying, "Bless God, even though you may die." That sounds much different, but it sounds like that's also a very viable translation. It can go either way. And then again, that can fit with the context of the book, what's going on in Job, where she also is caught in the middle of what's going on and not fully understanding. Either way, Job rejects her words. So what does Job's wife teach us? She teaches us that sympathy, it can be hard to come by. Or she may be teaching that sympathy may not be well received. Either one. Sympathy can be hard to come by, or she may be teaching that sympathy may not always be well received. First, she may be saying exactly what we've read, curse God and die. When can sympathy be hard to come by? What are some times when sympathy can be hard to come by? Right now, sympathy, empathy is needed. Because of my skin color, I've not battled what other people that I know have had to battle all their lives. Where some see days of riots, others see generations of injustice exposed. Your vantage point often dictates your response. If you aren't black, have you talked to a black friend or church member or neighbor? There's much to be sympathetic about right now. There's much to be empathetic about right now. Sympathy can be hard when you're battling illness, as we see in the case of Job. I remember at different points in my wife's pregnancies, and her health and the baby's health were not always good. But what happens when you share that? Well, sometimes people, they tell you their story and they tell you how bad it was for them. When someone is hurting physically, there's much to be empathetic about. Empathetic with them, empathetic for them. If people around you have not experienced what you have, well, understanding can be hard to come by. Even though Mrs. Job had lost her kids, she may not have lost her health. So Mrs. Job may be an example that sympathy or understanding, it can sometimes be hard to come by. But Job's wife could also be saying, bless God even though you may die. Job's response is to call her a foolish woman. Sympathy may not always be well received. It's possible she meant well, bless God, even though you may die. And he says, you foolish woman. Think about his circumstances. Sympathy may not always be well received. Is there a time when you meant well with your words, but it wasn't received that way? A time when you meant well with your words, but it sure wasn't received that way. Think about that time. How would you describe that? Have you ever reached out to someone who was hurting and they didn't take it well? In that moment, in that conversation, it didn't go as you expected at all. You may not have been called foolish, but you may have been told to mind your own business, or you may have been told you just don't understand. So how did you feel when your actions were not met with the expected response? How'd that make you feel? It may have made you feel like you just wanted to walk away, just to step out of the situation, maybe just run from the situation. It may have made you feel like you needed to defend yourself and why you said it, and then you may have done one of those and it continued to not go well. So we don't know for sure what Mrs. Job did. We don't know that. She's not mentioned again, except for Job refers to his wife in a conversation with his friends much later in chapter 31. So are there times when it's better to be quiet than to speak? Are there times where it's better to be quiet than to speak? That's a big question, isn't it? No matter how you answer, you end up having to say more. Job, he can be a reminder of perseverance and patience, but our neighbor, his wife, can remind you to have a sympathetic heart and sympathetic words, no matter how we translate that, bless or curse. My wife and I have led grief support groups. One resounding problem that comes up in every group is from the hurting people who say that no one said anything to them when they were hurting so bad and people did not say anything. Why don't people speak? Because they don't always know what to say. With today's racial injustice, the same thing has happened. When someone has lost a family member or lost a job or lost their dream, the same thing has happened. Silence cannot be the answer. So what does Job's wife teach us? Well, she teaches us that sympathy can be hard to come by. Or she may be teaching that sympathy is not always well received. So, a call to action. Whom can you comfort this week? Whom can you comfort this week? Who is it that needs to hear from you? And maybe you just spoke with them yesterday or just earlier today. Or maybe you haven't spoke to them for a long time, and maybe not at all. But who is it that needs to be comforted by you? Who needs to hear some words, see some actions from you? What will you say? What will you do? And also be thinking, what happens if it's not well received? What happens if it's not well received? A compassionate heart and words that match. They were needed centuries ago, and they're still needed today. We learn that from our neighbor.